Hello, and welcome to another edition of Arena Craft, a podcast focused exclusively on Magic the Gathering Arena. My name is Arjuna, I am your host, and we're going to get into it quickly today because this ended up being a long episode I recorded with our guest earlier this week, and so I'm going to be playing it back for you here. We are talking about Standard. Just wanted to give a shout out to Andre Strasky for taking down the weekly Magic Fest online championship playing Bant. So, as I will call it later in this episode, Bant proving itself to officially be the best deck in Standard, or at least a very strong contender at any rate. Gonna skip shout outs and all that kind of other stuff and just get to the content. So, enjoy. So today's guest is someone that I have met more recently and someone who I've discovered through his fantastic and to be honest, quite incredible Baroque articles on Cool Stuff Inc. Someone who clearly has made his way around many different parts of thinking and interests than just Magic. But also someone who's been very committed to Magic for many years, spent a couple of years being the editor-in-chief for SCG, also got really well known for appearing in some Commander Versus videos with SCG. Anyway, someone with a long breadth of history with the game. So let's welcome to the show, Danny West. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing quite well. I'm very comfortable in quarantine, so happy to be talking to another human being, let alone about Magic.
Yeah, you know, it's funny how there are some people in the world for whom quarantine is maybe not only not particularly inconvenient, but maybe has even some silver linings to it.
It happens. It happens.
It happens occasionally. So you haven't been going stir crazy yet, is what I'm hearing from you.
No, but when you have Magic Arena, I mean, it's pretty hard to go stir crazy.
Indeed. As I think many of our listeners and many people in the world have probably been discovering lately, it's a good use of the time. We're going to talk about Standard today, and I think a lot of people have had this question on their mind of like, how do I get into Standard right now? So we're going to go into that. But first, I just wanted to ask you really quick about just your history with Magic. You know, how long have you been playing? I know that there's a breadth of experience there, but let's just get the Cliff Notes version of Danny West's history with Magic.
Danny West's history with Magic started in, I was 11 or 12. Mirage had just come out. When I learned, so I've been playing now over half my life.
Oh, heck yeah. I think that you and I are probably exactly the same age.
That's amazing.
Yep, because I was playing Mirage when I was like 12 as well.
Yeah, everybody that like got to tournaments before me but started then has lowered, they have like less digits in their DCI numbers.
Right.
My DCI number is like 8 digits, but when you start Mirage, it should be a little less. So I'm always bummed out. I didn't get to play in a tournament till like 3 years after I discovered the game, because now I have less clout or whatever, I guess. But like right. I was started Mirage, was super casual or whatever, but was like really obsessively into it all through like the rest of schooling and whatnot. I played for a while in college as well. And then I got into tournament Magic fairly seriously close to like 05, maybe 06, in that range. And then a few years later, some friends were getting picked up for jobs at SCG in Virginia. And then it was finally my turn to go over the falls in 2011. So I was with SCG from 2011 to 2019, and at this point I'm writing for Cool Stuff Inc. And then my non-writing Magic job is with Card Titan, which is they run the big Eternal Weekend, the big Vintage and Legacy Championships every year. And the Northeast up here has like an amazing Eternal Magic scene. So I work with them usually, but right now, as you know, everybody's in quarantine. But that's my Cliff Notes Magic history.
Yeah, it's it's always cool to talk with people whose trajectory of Magic is kind of like roughly matches mine, right? Because there are so many eras of Magic, and I think that Mirage kind of Visions era was like a particular moment when Magic was kind of picking up and taking a turn in a different direction. So anyway, that's just cool for me to think back on that time. So Standard, here we are. It's about 3 weeks before Ikoria drops, unless of course there's any kind of, pandemic change of schedule, but we're all expecting to see Ikoria in roughly 3 weeks. And there are a lot of people, including myself, full disclosure, who've just not really been feeling the Standard format lately. And I hear this all the time. I'm seeing posts on Reddit. I am having conversations in my Discord with my community about it. I'm seeing, people on Twitter complaining about it. And basically, it just seems like a lot of people are kind of fed up with the format at the moment. And it's a little odd, I think, for a lot of people because it has a lot of the markers of what people think of as being like a healthy format, a good format. There are viable aggro archetypes, viable control or controlling archetypes. We've got some mid-range decks in there. So it's like on paper, it feels like it should be at least some amount of fun. But a lot of people are just not quite feeling it right now. So what we wanted to get into today was to just go into the meta a little bit and give some of our thoughts on why people might be feeling that way, and also see if we can come up with some just like approaches for people to jump back into it a little bit, maybe try to pick up a little bit of a competitive edge, or just get a fresh way of thinking about it so that they can dive back in without having to just basically pretend that Standard doesn't exist for the next 3 weeks. So that's kind of the overview. Now, Danny, you just recently wrote an article on this topic that you published on Cool Stuff Inc. That's right?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I've written quite a few pieces on Standard recently. Strategically, it's been a few weeks, though, since I really spent much time with the format. But the article, I think, that we're basically referring to had to do with basically exploring, first of all, validating, like, feelings like you're talking about. Like, it's not your fault or anyone else's fault that they don't want to play. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're not required to, because a format is technically diverse in some sort of, loose framework, or it measures up this statistically, it's this many decks are viable versus in the past you could only, those are sort of like crutches, I think, that sort of hide the real conversation. And so like the article was just sort of exploring like, well, what do we want it to be? Like, if we don't want it to be this, that's perfectly fine. But like, let's think about some of the ways that we can improve upon maybe like the model of Standard as a concept, because we've been doing it more or less the same way for a really, really, really long time. And when you think about when Standard was conceived and why it was conceived and all these things, it's just such a far cry from the world, let alone Magic now. Like Arena and the way people engage with Magic is different. The idea of Standard and most of its rules more or less predates the ubiquity of the internet. So I think we get really traditionalist in some unproductive ways. So essentially it was exploring some of those things.
So now that's an interesting right there. That kind of gets my brain working as to like the concept of what Standard is. So, and I'm sure that you're thinking about that partially in relation to other formats, right? Which all kind of have their own concepts. So if you were to sum up what the concept of Standard has been for the foreseeable past, like how would you put that?
It expires too quickly on a regular basis.
Okay.
It no longer has a reliably long enough shelf life, and I think you can blame that on a lot of maybe attention spans are lower. We have faster information and more of it. I have to imagine by the time, I don't know, 2025, the amount of just individual Magic games that are going to take place just in general because of Arena are going to be way, I mean, this is a trend that's only going to increase. And so I think when you're using a model that you came up with before any of this was true, and you're expecting it to just sort of hold up through, decades of evolution and in the game's culture and how we approach it, like that's kind of a fool's errand. Like you're going to have to adapt in some way or another.
Right. It's just interesting for me to think about Standard in relation to other formats and now I don't play particularly other formats that often, but I kind of track them a little bit and I think about it. And something that I've been feeling lately, which is just kind of coming into my mind, is that Standard to me has been feeling lately like it's just inched a little closer to Modern. And what I mean by that is that Modern is this format which is really typified by decks that have like this really strong, I mean, not all of them, of course, but decks that have like a very strong proactive game plan, decks that are like really angling hard to do a busted thing. And because you don't have some of the really fast, efficient interaction in the format that you do in some of the older formats like Vintage or Legacy, right? You can't play Force of Will, stuff like that. You just see a lot of people pushing these really linear busted game plans like Amulet Titan or like Tron, stuff like this. And of course, Standard is nowhere near that speed or power level, but I do feel like a lot of the archetypes that we're seeing in Standard at the moment are really pushing towards that. They're like really trying to exploit these cards that are just like straight busted in a way that I think that we haven't seen in Standard for a long time. So when I think about a lot of the cards that are most successful in the format, we're looking at things like Fires of Invention, busted card. Wilderness Reclamation, busted card. Embercleave, busted card. Oro, busted card. And of course, Oro's seeing play in pretty much every format that it's legal in at this point as well. So that one's not just restricted to Standard. But it's like I'm noticing this trend towards these cards that like they just turn the volume up or like they turn the pressure up in a way that I feel like hasn't been normal for Standard certainly in my tenure. I feel like oftentimes there might be like one busted deck at a time in the format, whereas it feels like so many of the archetypes I'm seeing now have this feeling to me of like, this just feels kind of unfair. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that you make a lot of very accurate points there. One thing that comes to mind is this notion of modern style combos, or like really the one that sticks out to me, and this may be just because I played the food deck a lot late last year, but Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven type stuff, things of that nature feel very I think you're like absolutely right. Like that feels like a very sort of modern type angle, like this really sort of obnoxious, untraditional, weird angle that is sort of miserable to interact with and results in like really repetitive play patterns. There's a subset of players who communicated, I mean, it's probably anecdotal. I don't know. I'm not inside Wizards. I don't have market data or whatever, but there's a subset of players that for a long time bereaved the idea that combo was not okay in Standard. And so at this point, like, I think that at least that subset of players should look at this and think about sort of what the cost of having those kinds of things are, because I'm okay with them if people want them. But at the same time, you've got to understand that the novelty of being able to sort of do this cute solitaire thing, that's got to last 2 years. People have to do that for 2 years, and they've got to do it every Friday night, and they've got to do it, and we're playing so much more Magic now. Like, I think the time of like where you want these sorts of gimmicks in these little pockets of obnoxious combo type pieces in Standard decks is probably gone, because the shelf life with Arena will only get shorter. The more times we play, the more times we're exposed to the same play patterns, the same cards, the same game states, the same situations. So that's only going to increase. So I think that needs to go. I think that's not where you want your introductory format to be. And if the subset of players who like genuinely thinks that this is like where how Magic should play or whatever, I mean, I think they're just going to have to be the minority on that one. I just don't think that that's a sustainable way it's just like, I don't want to think about Witch's Oven Cauldron Familiar when I think about playing Magic cards and stuff. You know what I mean? Like, it's not very exciting. So that was a big thing. And I do think you're right. It really does steer more towards some of these cards. And the one that really jumps out at me, and maybe it's after the fact. I certainly didn't flag it beforehand, but I also didn't pay attention that much. But the Titan of Death's Hunger, the 2-mana Rakdos card, Kroxa. Yeah. That just seems like, I mean, man alive, that's like such a modern card.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's a modern Horizons type wacko push card. It's just like, if we're going to do this thing where we're like having these sets where we're no longer making sets pay the toll to go through standard. You know what I mean? We can just put cards in modern. I'm not sure what the upside is of like putting these like wackadoo Oko type cards in standard when, I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm really sympathetic. I think people sort of over complain a lot, or have in the past in general. But at the point, it's hard to sympathize with like blatant dev failures that just happened. And like Oko was ridiculous. Like that was I don't know how to historically contextualize it. Like, I don't think it's like Skull Clamp bad, but it was like the fact that that's even, I can put them in the same sentence is kind of insane, right? Like, that's not like an unreasonable thought.
Right.
So yeah, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure that I like, there's just appear to be just holes in the pockets of some of these ideas, just sort of fundamentally. And so I think it's hard to work on sort of like the nuance of like the top level of like what we ideally want in standard, when it's just like really hard to know where we're at on data when you get cards like Oko and stuff that just come in and just don't even make sense. Like it's hard to even know what like the goal was when a card warps something that badly or fails in development that badly.
Right. And I think, yeah, you bring up a good point too, that it's kind of like this is like a certain era of development. And, I'm sure that the Magic devs are already have been paying a lot of attention to how people feel about this, but like, Magic has developed so far in advance that like they can't necessarily just jump in and stop the train, right? So
it's an 18-wheeler. Yeah. They have to U-turn it all the time. And it's like, you can always, that's one of my favorite things to do. And like when you look at sets and things, like it's so much fun to find these cards that like don't seem to make any sense. But like if you go back and think about like a card that was too good and got banned, but this may have sort of kept it in, you know what I mean? Like things just go wrong, but you can see where they tried to fix it, but by the time it came to us, it was already too late, kind of thing. It's really funny. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And it's an interesting job they have. So I don't want to rip on the Magic devs because, it's pretty hard to like predict the future. And it's pretty, you don't have access to the supercomputer that is millions of people playing millions upon millions of games of Arena around the world every week, right? So they don't have access to that in development. So, it's hard to come down too hard on them. But I do think that we're seeing right now, it's like some of the continued fallout of the kinds of design philosophy that gave us Oko, right? So even though Oko's out of the standard format and a lot of other formats to boot, even though we have other cards like Veil of Summer have been banned, Once Upon a Time, these are all cards that people have complained about being super busted. So even though we have those removed from the format, it's like we're still existing in a format that was, at least in theory, designed to be powerful enough to fight against stuff like that. So I think what we're forced to do now is just try to pick up the pieces of how do we approach standard in a way that feels fun, and how can we approach standard in a way to where we're not just feeling a victim to busted cards all the time. here's an example. One of the reasons I have not been enjoying Standard lately, and this is definitely not a complain stream. I just want to put that out right there. I'm not my goal in recording this episode was not to just whine for an hour. So we're gonna get through this part.
I'm a very optimist. I'll put a shine on it. You get all the complaints you want in right now. We can always elevate it afterwards.
There you go.
It's good for you. It's healthy.
But one of the cards that I have been enjoying playing against the least in the current format is Elspeth Conquers Death. And one of the reasons that I don't like this card, it's funny because if you look at it in a way, it just doesn't look on first blush like the kind of card that someone would look at and say, oh, that's going to make this format suck. I don't want to play Standard now they printed that card. But it's the kind of card where once it starts coming down and you start seeing how games play out, the experience is just quite miserable. So, you have like a classic thing like, okay, someone played Nissa, which is another card that I'm just not particularly happy to play against game after game. And I had an answer. I dealt with it. And then, suddenly, boom, Elspeth Conquers Death comes down, exiles my best threat. And what do you know? I'm going to have to deal with Nissa in a couple turns as well. This kind of like built-in, I think a lot of the cards that are happening in Standard right now have this kind of built-in, like, I resolve this card and this cool thing happens now, but other even nastier things are about to happen because I resolved this card. Another classic example that we've been dealing with forever is Hydroid Krasis, right? It's like someone plays a Krasis, it's like, cool, all right, like I could deal with the 6/6 or the 8/8 trampling flyer, but, I don't know that I can particularly deal with all of the gas that this person just drew into their hand, and so there are just like a lot of cards that come down in Standard, and you just have this sinking feeling in your gut, like, oh man, like I was just starting to feel good about this game. I was just starting to feel like I'd turned the corner. I was just starting to feel like my game plan had, was kind of coming together, and all of a sudden this thing that wasn't a problem anymore, all of a sudden my running my opponent out of resources for the last 7 turns doesn't matter.
Let's look at, okay, so on Elspeth Conquers Death, I think one of the first thing that comes to mind for me is that it's a sort of a niche new, it's technically a subtype, but a saga is a new, this is only the second time, right? Dominaria had sagas.
Right.
And then we've got new sagas here.
Correct.
So historically, whenever their sample size on a new concept or card type or whatever is low, it gets really bad before it gets better. So this may be that. They did it with, Mirrodin was a disaster with equipment and cranial. Mirrodin was just a development mess from head to toe. So there was that one, Smuggler's Copter, they had to ban. That was the first vehicle cards or whatever. And then Aetherworks Marvel was an energy card that had to be banned. They really struggle with when it's like a brand new thing and they don't know how to cost it. They don't have this giant 25-year body of like how this is going to work in the game. So hopefully that we're like Elspeth Conquers Death is sort of the bottom of that barrel and we start moving the other way. I think the fundamental issue with a saga when it's not producing the patterns that make players happy is that as cool as the concept is, there's a very literal scripting going on. You can see turns ahead in a fairly, like a somewhat transparent way in most game states. When this card is sitting out here, especially if you've played a few games with the matchup before, what it's going to do is staring you in the face, and you don't have to be like a rocket scientist to know like what chapter 3 is going to get back. So you play right. These states out where you just know what's going to happen, and you sort of have to go through the motions. And like it's sort of coincidentally thematic, but Elspeth, Sun's Champion from Theros Standard, had a sort of similar pattern of essentially where the game ends the turn it lands a lot of the time, but you're not technically dead until it -7s 7 turns from now after you fought uphill against it or whatever. So I think those types of patterns are like one of the big things I would look at in terms of what makes things stale. You want Magic games to create stories. You want surprises. And when you can see 3 turns ahead and know exactly what the sequence is going to be, and furthermore that there are not going to be surprises, ergo there's not going to be a good story associated with any of this and all that. So that's where I think you can really make a claim that that sort of design is a little too risky. But on the other hand, like, I mean, hell, if it costs 7, are we even having this conversation? You know, so like maybe it may just be that they don't have enough data on like how these work. And it also, everything's about context. I mean, Teferi, 3-minute Teferi has been like an issue, right? People have really loathed playing against 3-minute Teferi for a while, as far as I know. Like, it's just not pleasant. So like, it may just
really?
be like...
I hadn't heard that, to be honest. I must have
really?
just not been paying attention.
I just slipped that in. Okay, yeah. I'm just the anti-Teferi defamation league. And so, like, it may just be, like, part of it may just be the framing, too. So it's like, not only are you playing against this card where the sequences are scripted, but you know you're going to have to deal with this other pain-in-the-ass card that you're sick of playing against, too. So, like, sometimes it's the breaks, but I don't know. That's part of why the job is so hard to begin with, is because not only are you having to think in the future, which is just not possible. Like, I don't know that I've gone into enough detail in an article yet, but like, I could probably do it. Like, I could probably like do the digging and just do a mathematical proof showing why the people in Renton are never going to make like the ideal it just can't be done or whatever. So, like, they have my sympathy, but, like, at the same time, like, you do see these little aggravating factors, like, Teferi, that means 2 or 3 more Teferis every game. I can't even beat the ones that they had before this card came out. Like, there's a lot of issues sort of in the margins that I think are, you know, I don't know if ultimately they're changeable, but it's like, on the surface, they certainly, the conversation could be had that, like, these problems in places are preventable.
Right. I mean, I'm definitely with you, and I like that you made a distinction there between like powerful cards and fun cards, and like powerful play patterns and fun play patterns, because I've heard multiple people say this, and I actually agree with this. People will look back on the Eldraine standard with Oko in it, and they'll say, yeah, that was busted. Oko obviously shouldn't have been in the format. However, I was still having more fun playing that format than I have been playing this format. And that's exactly how I feel. I actually played a heck of a lot of standard during Oko's reign of terror. And I'm not going to defend that card because that card sucked. But I still had fun in the format. And I think that part of it is just because, you know, at least there were like exciting things happening. We had cards like Lucky Clover, right? Which is a powerful card, but it's a fun card. You know, we had cards like the Great Henge, which is another card that's like, yeah, it's super strong. And if you get it set up properly, it can feel kind of unfair. But it's a fun card to build around. It's a fun card to play against. It's a fun puzzle to try to solve. And I think that one of the reasons that people are starting to not have as much fun is that a card like Uro, I think from an opponent's perspective, is just not a particularly fun puzzle to try to solve. You know, you're like, great. Unless I have targeted graveyard hate, I just have to figure out a way to deal with this, you know, 6/6 life gaining card advantage engine for the entire rest of the game. Or, you know, or Elspeth Conquers Death is just this card of like, great. Like, they're not going to ban that card. No one's going to ban Elspeth Conquers Death, but that doesn't make it fun, right? It doesn't make it a fun card to play against. So I like that they make that distinction, because not all busted cards are unfun, and not all fair cards are fun. So that's just something that's been on my mind a lot, is that you can have a format which feels balanced, in which no particular strategy feels particularly dominant. But if it's just producing play patterns that aren't enjoyable, then that's kind of failing the mandate. And in a way, I would much rather have to deal with a card like Smuggler's Copter, for example. I mean, I like Smuggler's Copter. I'm a fanboy, so I have to own up to that. But I would much rather deal with the Smuggler's Copters of the world as opposed to the Nexus of Fates of the world. You know, it's like Smuggler's Copter at least is a card that you can kind of interact with, and it kind of asks certain questions of you. And there are a number of ways to attack a deck playing a card like that, whereas Nexus of Fate asks some very, very boring questions that a lot of people are just not particularly interested in answering.
Yeah. I think you're actually being too kind in places, because you've said twice now something like along the lines of, it doesn't really give like an interesting problem, or it doesn't give like it doesn't ask a very interesting question. I'm not sure like that it asks any. Like what, like aren't these, like does Nexus of Fate ask a question? Like at the point of Uro, like at the point, like how many game states where Uro does what Uro does and then the other player doesn't do something that's roughly Uro-like or an imitation of the same Uro pattern or whatever? Like if you don't keep up with the other Uro, like what's your puzzle? Like, where is the puzzle at all? Like, show me the math in any of the configurations of how those games can go from there, where there is a puzzle. Like, those are, I think maybe not liking certain puzzles, like, that's one thing. But I think when you routinely play games where you don't feel like you had an opportunity to even engage with a puzzle, like no puzzle presented itself, I think that's a much bigger issue.
Mm. That's a really great distinction. Yeah, I like that. Cards are being played, decisions are being made, creatures are being turned sideways, but you don't feel like you have a lot of agency in the outcome of the game.
And that is everything. That is absolutely everything.
Right. And I agree that when your main agency is, do I run Agonizing Remorse to just try to exile this before I have to deal with it? Like that is also not a particularly fun puzzle to solve, right? It's like, okay, did I draw my remorse? No. Okay, well, that puzzle wasn't very fun, was it? You know? So,
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we've done a pretty good job of identifying the problem. Now,
some of them. I want to complain about one more thing.
Okay, all right, lay it on me.
Because it just occurred to me that Oko and Uro have the same mana cost, right?
Yes.
Why don't they just, like, stop making the green-blue cards? Like, so nuts, you know?
I know.
It's like why don't you add a mana cost or two and see what happens? Just
give it a try.
Just as an experiment. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, Standard and EDH don't necessarily need to be the same format. You don't have to, like, make all the green and blue cards so much better than the other ones. Anyway, carry on.
And the irony is that we're living in the age of Simic Ascendancy, and then they had to go and print the actual card Simic Ascendancy and have it be so bad. I mean,
well, that is, yeah.
It's a shame. That's all I have to say is it's a shame.
They blew it. Yeah.
Yeah, they really did. But I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. So that pivots into, I want to talk a little bit about, okay, what are we actually seeing in the meta, right? What are the archetypes that we're seeing? And a lot of the ones that we're seeing the most of, and I would argue that a lot of the ones that people are the most tired of, have Simic in them. So if we're looking at a lot of the most dominant archetypes, I would probably just hazard a guess that Bant, some build of Bant, is probably going to be the strongest deck in the format at the moment. I don't know if that's the consensus, but that's kind of the impression that I've been getting. And then, of course, Sultai as well. It's another color combination that plays Simic, which is also seeing a lot of play and is definitely among the more powerful decks in the format. And then, of course, we're seeing kind of a revitalization of just plain old Simic as well. Like a lot of people are saying, yeah, this color combination is just busted, so why don't I just play it? That's definitely happening a lot in the meta right now. Now, I think I would say one of the saving graces of this format, which isn't to say that people don't still hate playing against this deck, but one of the saving graces, in my opinion, is that Rakdos is actually a playable archetype. And it's been a while. Like, I think it's been a while since we've seen a really solid Rakdos deck in the standard format that could really post results. I mean, okay, Rakdos Knights happened, so that was a thing. And I think that deck had its moment it had its fun in the sun, and maybe that's all that's going on here. Maybe Rakdos is, like the deck of the week, right? Maybe we're not going to see this deck stick around, but I don't know. This deck seems to have legs to me. What do you think about this?
I don't know. Kroxa is such a ridiculous amount of card text for the mana cost. Yeah, I mean, it's just a silly, it's a modern card. So it's like, if you just, it wasn't abysmal to begin with. Like, Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven alone, like, invalidates a lot of proactive Magic just to begin with. So it doesn't take long to add, like, if you add in a modern card that just ticks all the boxes you could possibly want with everything else the deck is doing, then, like, there's no reason it can't get bumped up. I mean, like, it has a functional Thoughtseize. Like, Agonizing Remorse is, like, a really adequate, like, impersonation of it, especially, like, in a format where people are, like, casting these, you know, where people are playing games that don't revolve around what you do on turn one or whatever. Like, the extra turn really doesn't matter that much. So, being that that's what it is, like, I don't see any reason. Like, this does happen from time to time. Even, like, in 2013, like, the Thragtusk format. The Thragtusk format had, like, a Rakdos deck sneak in and just, like, surprise people by dealing enough sort of synergistic, sacrificial, goofy interaction damage in addition to the attacking it was doing or whatever, and gaining 10, 15 life sometimes wasn't enough. So, like, these little goofy interactions do sneak in, but, like, especially because of the Kroxa, the Mythic, like, the deck was fine, it was adequate anyway, so, like, and God knows there's enough people working on it. What fascinates me most is, like, how much hype. Do you remember, like, were you around in preview season where, like, everybody was like, Judith is going to make Rakdos, like, a deck? Like, yeah. And it's just, like, that card is so below the bar because of how absurd. Like, this, you're right. Like, you put it well. Like, Judith is a standard card, and you gotta be, like, half a freaking modern card to see plays in, like, decks like this. And especially, it's, like, a bigger standard, too. Like, we've got, like, we had, like, Eldraine and, like, as a supplemental sort of Cold Snap-esque, like, it's one of those standards where, like, the sets and the cards really start stacking up. So it's like, if you shove enough, like, 2 or 3 modern cards into all these sets, like, eventually, especially since the mana is so good anyway, like, we've got all the Shocklands we want and all that stuff. So, like, you can do what you want. So at that point, yeah, enough modern cards will make a standard deck playable / ridiculous.
I will agree that this deck is definitely getting helped along by Kroxa, although I have admittedly seen some versions of this archetype which seemed at least somewhat playable without the Kroxa in it. However, I do think that this is kind of one of the ideal cards in the archetype, and so I would definitely be running Far Off if I were to play this deck. But this deck has also been doing well in the Magic Fest online weekly championships. So we're actually, to aid us in this recording, I have pulled up Channel Fireball's article on the Magic Fest online weekly championship top 8 deck lists. And I'm going to put this in the show notes so that you can look at this as well. Obviously, if you've been following along with the standard format, you've probably been looking at some of these lists already. Just personally, I was happy to see this deck in the format because I just think that it's doing something that is enough different and it's playing enough interesting, or cards that are interesting to me anyway, that I'm happy to see it. And I also like that it's designed with cards like Claim the Firstborn, for example, which can really punish Oro decks or punish other decks in the format that are trying to, play these Cavalier of Thorns, kind of play these really, or maybe try to resolve a massive crisis. It's punishing decks for doing stuff like that. And so I think it's like playing a foil on the format. I, for one, am a fan that this card is in the format, even though it's got the cauldron, the cat oven thing going on. It's not like, this deck is not super dirtily the way the Jund food decks of previous iterations have been, right? Like, this isn't the deck where you're spending 20 minutes like staring your opponent down while they activate their Trail of Crumbs 15 times.
Over and over.
Exactly.
Yep. I lived it, man. I lived it. Like, it felt like a cube deck. It felt like a combo cube deck, like a Magic Cardsmith deck kind of thing. Like, it was just like the abilities together just seemed like they were fictional. Like, they just seemed like something somebody would like make up as like their goofy, gimmicky, overpowered combo cube. But, there it was, Trail of Crumbs drawing like 7 cards a turn and shit. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this deck is a little less egregious because it's more in the line of just like straight up killing a fool, or just, you know what I mean? Or just like really using claim to just do some blowout dome damage on somebody who's just not paying attention or whatever. Like, that's a lot more. I think that's kind of the hero. I guess you could say that's like the best case scenario Cauldron Familiar deck, right? Like one that just like gets it over with and uses it basically as, I don't know, like a recurring Mog Fanatic or something, as opposed to like the Cauldron Familiar that just sits there and acts like Maze of Ith, and then you've got to play for another 35 minutes. So I could see why this deck, you know, if you're going to have some of that stuff, I guess, yeah, like it can and has gone worse than this version, so.
I agree. I'm happy to see a Rakdos that's actually focused on killing you. That's a nice thing to see. Just quick little complaint equity thing here. I do think that Mayhem Devil is one of the less fun cards to play against in the format. So that's another card that's unlikely to ever get banned. But I'm a little bit tired of Mayhem Devil at this point, and definitely a central card in basically any Rakdos strategy, apart from like a streamlined Knights strategy that's happening at the moment. But I like this deck. I think that it has the tools to compete. Claim the Firstborn is really a wrecking for any of these decks that are trying to go big. Black has access to a surprisingly excellent sideboard suite at the moment. You get to run stuff like Agonizing Remorse. You can do Timurit or even Ashiok, the 3-mana Ashiok, if you're having problems like graveyard problems. It has access to an excellent removal suite. You can even, you can play Duress if you're expecting to come up against some control matchups, or if you're just, again, wanting to try to punish these growth spiral decks. So I think overall Black is fairly well positioned. Now, I think one of the reasons we haven't been seeing as much Black in this standard is that Black hasn't had any of these like super over the top things going on. What's the most busted mono Black card? I was having this conversation in my Discord a little while ago. Like, what's the most busted mono Black card in the format? It was like hard for me to even think of what it is. I'm
a little out of touch. Bolus's Citadel came to mind.
Well, that's like funny.
On its own, or Liliana maybe.
That's funny because that's what I was just going to say is that Bolus's Citadel is probably the most like breakable or the most in danger of being broken card. But that card has actually proved itself to be a very balanced card in the standard format. It's like, if your opponent resolves it and you lose that game, you don't walk away thinking like, oh, that was BS. It's like you're usually like, okay, you got that, that's fine.
Yeah, it's right at it's a card that always seems to dig its heels in right at like the crux of the game turning. It's never happening just so soon. You're like, well, they had it again, I'm boned. It always seems to happen like when it is just right. That tension is just between both players is just really palpable. And then it usually turns it like right at the last second, which is ideally where you want it to be. Like, not every card can do that, but like, as far as that, I mean, that's a pretty ideal play pattern.
It is. And it's also, speaking of solvable puzzles, it's one of those things where it's like, well, if I can get your life total low enough before you slam this, then you might be locked out of using it. So yeah, that's a card that presents interesting play patterns on both sides, right? It's interesting for the person playing it, interesting for the person playing against it. Now, unfortunately...
I call that the Gristle Brand Race.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yeah, because we're in Legacy, you only have, like if your only shot is to, like, get them to 7 so they can't draw you out or whatever. And then, I guess, I'm trying to think of another example. So, maybe something like Bitter Blossom. That card usually killed you, but, like... There were a lot of games where like you were just like fingers crossed, get them to 3, get them to 2, and hope it's enough kind of thing. So yeah, that play pattern is. I mean, it makes for good games in general. I think usually. I
think so. Now, of course, Bolus's Citadel seeing basically no play in standard at the moment, probably because it's just not busted enough. But anyway, so this Rakdos Sacrifice deck, this particular one played by Aniol Alcaraz, but there are a lot of versions floating around. I would definitely point you towards this deck if you are someone who's been playing Standard and you've been tired of losing to the Simic combination decks, Simic X decks. This is one of the first places I would point to because I think that this deck has a reasonable matchup. I think that any deck that can have reach doing damage, basically, any deck that has like a burn sub game, I think is pretty good right now, because any green deck these days is just going to be clogging the board up with, these big Crasises, Nissa animating a bunch of lands, Oros, and even dorky stuff like the Sloth, the Arboreal Grazer, or, Cavalier of Thorns. It's like that card's such a bummer for if you're playing any deck that wants to attack, right? Because that card is just such a brick wall for so many cards in the format. I mean, and it's actually one of the reasons why I think both of the Titans are really good right now, is that there's some of the few cards that can actually attack favorably into a Cavalier of Thorns on curve, right? Like they can kind of keep pace with a card like that. Now, of course, you do have to actually be able to escape them. But
yeah, and it's convoluted because it's one of those, it's current Magic exchange where like at some point the card advantage like it's impossible to even track. Like once both players have gotten deep enough into the game where they've swapped 3 or 4 of these stupid things, swinging into each other, trigger this, trigger, it's like, who knows? But if you're looking at just like who gets the heads up, like it's reductionist, but that's still just like hard stats. Like you're going to have to push through that eventually. And yeah, they do push through those guys.
Yeah, exactly. So just being able to have a deck that can actually do damage outside of just attacking, if damage is your plan, right? Like if damage is your game plan, because I think this is what will happen a lot in this format with red, is if you're playing one of these mono red decks, they've really pivoted away from doing a lot of damage to the face, and they really have started to rely more on attacking to get the job done. And I mean, I think that that's been a solid plan because, you can't play the previous red game of just throwing enough burn spells at the face in this format because people are gaining so much life. It's like, your average mono red deck that's trying to burn someone out just can't keep pace with even a couple of Oros getting resolved in a game. There's so much incidental life gain going on that's kind of a hard thing to keep up with. And so, and also just leveraging the power of Embercleave, which is, of course, the overpowered, busted card that red gets access to in this format. But I think as a result of that, decks that do have a strong defensive power, like these green decks that can often side into things like Lovestruck Beast, decks that are main decking Cavalier of Thorns, decks that are running Arboreal Grazer, right? It's like as a red aggressive player, it can be pretty difficult, even with strong things like Embercleave and Torbrand in your deck. It can just be difficult to get around all of that.
One of the biggest things people underrate is when the Embercleave red decks were first starting to gain traction and were starting to get obnoxious, whatever that was, month or so back or whatever, maybe 6 weeks-ish. So like when these decks were first sort of annoying people, and I really, really, really felt like this deck was going to fall off once people were willing to do the Embercleave math. And I think that's a huge part of what scaled it back and made it evolve into not just people having the 0-3 for ones to just block, but people just intrinsically, instinctively knowing that the math is different than they thought it was before they started just getting blown out by Embercleave all the time. Once people experience those play patterns enough and they adjust their behavior, especially in conjunction with cards like the Grazer 0-3s for 1, or like the Birth of Melodus that puts the 0-4 and all that stuff, it really becomes harder for the red deck to keep pace when that confluence of stuff comes into play.
Totally. And also just having one of the issues of a card like Embercleave is when you have other cards that are incidentally good in the format that just kind of hose it, right? So like just having Teferi take out your Embercleave plan incidentally, that can be a real feels bad.
Yeah.
Or when people start running more Brazen Borrowers, or as soon as a deck like Flash, any of these Flash archetypes start to come back, just decks with more instant speed interaction, more counters, stuff like that, then your Embercleave plan gets a lot worse.
Yeah, it's a card that's extremely powerful, but that is in addition to being in a strategy that is just inherently, just by its very nature, all in most of the time, it's just much harder to adjust. Like, the format has so many powerful cards, and so, it has mana accelerants. It just has every type of thing you could possibly ask for in order to build like a Magic deck that's creeping toward like sort of the ridiculous or unfair, or sort of like I'm playing Commander and Standard kind of stuff. It gets really hard, even with access to a card like Embercleave, for just a deck that's wanting to play Shock Magic, even really strong Shock Magic, to realistically compete without approaching the sorts of backdoor angles that this Rakdos Sack deck is playing.
Right. Totally. No, I totally agree. Yeah, so I like these Rakdos builds as an alternative. And it's not that mono red is not viable in the format, but I just think like people come prepared. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah,
if you're
they've
playing,
got brains too, man. Yeah, for sure.
This is like if you're playing any amount of Standard right now, like you've probably answered the question of how does my deck beat mono red. So I think if you're a mono red mage, you just have to be really prepared for that.
Look at the mana costs on this deck as well. Like, this is a deck that just has, like we mentioned, Bolas' Citadel being like, you know, way up the curve, and we talked about it. This is a deck that just like, it is not interested in anything but cards that will both do the job and do it for no pay. Like, this is a deck packed with cards that just, it will not answer, even in the sideboard, it will not answer the door for a card over 4 mana. And when you're doing that, and you can focus, like Castle Lochthwain as well is like a really reasonable way to like keep an aggro deck going as long as it's in black. Like, that's a really effective way to get under a format that thinks it has all day because it's playing with Wilderness Reclamation or Hydroid or any of this stuff. And we do have like a Skullcrack effect in the format, right? With the giant, the split card that stomps, right? Or does it prevent damage?
Yep.
Does it prevent life gain?
Yeah, damage can't be prevented. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So like that's that the rate on that card has been thought of to be reasonable, and this deck wants nothing to do with it. Like, that speaks to the absurd high ceiling of like the aggro ridiculousness that this deck is working with.
No, that's actually a really insightful take on it, right? Like, because you're right, that card would just be a little bit too slow for this deck.
Exactly. But that was a card that like had a reasonable share of the format not that long ago. Like, it was thought to be like a staple of like what you wanted to do if you were just sort of streamlined all in aggro. And this deck wants nothing to do with it because it's not mana efficient enough, and it's not close enough to like the crux of the synergy of all these backdoor plans and stuff it's got going on. It doesn't want to do these little interactive prevention games. It wants to just establish, get it over with before these other decks get going.
Yeah. Yep. I love that. I think that's a really key omission that tells a story about this deck. And this has been on my mind for a while, actually. I've brought this up in previous episodes about the mana to damage equation that I see in Standard a lot. And it really is a big question. It's like, if you are playing a deck which aims to kill the opponent via damage in this format, you really do have to ask yourself, are my cards efficient enough? And I think it's one of the reasons we've seen Gruul aggro fall off a little bit in a lot, actually, in Standard, is just that it's just not the most efficient damage-based deck in the format. And one of the reasons why you see so much Gruul aggro in Historic, where that is probably the preeminent aggro archetype in Historic, is because the equation is vastly changed by cards like Burning Tree Emissary, which is absolutely the most mana efficient way to generate damage in that format. So I think that this is a broader question that you have to ask yourself, is how efficiently am I able to convert mana into damage? How efficiently and how quickly can I do that?
To tie the two sort of big overarching discussions so far, the what's wrong with the Standard experience or whatever, and what's going on right now in Standard. I wrote a piece recently called Ideas for Magic's Future, and one of the important key aspects in this is, and I thought of it because you mentioned the concept of the ratio of card per damage, or whatever that equation is, to have to be able to make a competitive cut in a Standard deck or any format or whatever. And the idea was that one of the really untweaked knobs of Magic that could really radically change a format experience is life total. It's really interesting to think about what this deck would look like, or what this format would look like if we started from 26 or 28. Would Embercleave still be too good in some people's? It changes a conversation. It just changes the conversation and changes the experience of this format in such a way for such a minute and easy communicated change. So I wouldn't have mentioned that, except for I think it just ties both of the major themes of what we've talked about so far. In terms of when you said damage to ratio, it's just so funny that like that entire standard is based on the notion that we start at 20 life, but we only start at 20 life because Richard Garfield thought, hey, 20 life, but Commander players, they went to 40 life and it radically changed that experience. And you know what I mean? Like, it's a really underutilized way to think about like how efficiently you could change a format just by making such a small change.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think it's one of the reasons why this format is the way it is at the moment is because a lot of players, because of cards like Oro, are effectively starting the game at 23 life at least. And
yeah, exactly. And it's like, it becomes you sort of get into the steroids in baseball and 90s paradigm where it's like, well, you can either do what I'm doing and also start at 23 life, or you can be at a disadvantage. And that's not where you want to be.
Yeah, no, especially since Magic for so long, like these damage-based decks for so long have been designed to get in just enough damage, like to get you to 0 or lower life right as they run out of cards, right? And so, yeah, you're right. In a format where a substantial number of the decks are starting with a life total higher than 20, it really does change the discussion. And I think it's one of the reasons why like this Rakdos Sacrifice deck is a thing, is because it's the kind of deck that can just consistently generate damage from a number of angles. You've consistently got Croxa threatening to deal you 3 damage at least on the attack. You've consistently got cards like Mayhem Devil, like the combination of Mayhem Devil with the Cat Oven, right, is another repetitive source of damage. So this is a deck that's aiming to, that can play the long game of damage, which a lot of decks have not been able to do. And of course, being able to do it from the graveyard is huge too. So that's I think it's another reason why we're not seeing as much control at the moment in the format, like pure control, like the Azorius thing, because it's kind of hated out by a strategy like that. I mean, this would...
I'll be honest, I couldn't believe it stayed around as long as it just seems like such a weird, like, not so much the recent ones, but like, I don't know. Can you look at this deck and think, yes, I want to play Absorb? You know what I mean? Like, what are you doing? Like, you're playing, like, 2002 Magic.
Yep.
And that's not, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
you don't, that's not going to cut it.
No.
Elspeth Conquers Death. I'm just looking at all these cards to which, like, I don't know. I just cannot, I know Teferi is something, and I guess Dream Trawler? That card, when you have those two cards, that carries a lot of weight, but man, it's just, whew. Like, I don't know that I played Mana Leak in this format. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this seems, it's just like, so I'm just surprised it took as long as it did for that deck to sort of start falling off.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting because even up until recently, it has been posting results, which I think just speaks to the power of cards like Dream Trawler, and Elspeth Conquers Death. I think those two cards are probably some of the strongest ones that keep it around. But I agree, we're not seeing much of it in the current standard, and I think it's for exactly those reasons. It just feels like a bit of an antiquated way of playing. Again, it's just like when the most powerful thing your deck can do is put a Dream Trawler on the table, like sometimes that's just not powerful enough, which sounds kind of ridiculous to say, but here we are.
You want it to be. Yeah, I think but like that's a world where like I think I want that to be the case, but it's not. Like, I would rather, I mean, it's actually very in my wheelhouse. Like, I love playing like negate, absorb, Jace Beleren type Magic, but I don't want to do it in a format with some of this stuff.
Some of this nonsense.
Some of this, I mean, it's just, man,
So
The graveyard's any format where the graveyard is just like another hand. I don't want to be playing Absorb.
yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, speaking of control, let's talk about the second deck on this top 8.
Oh my!
List. Now, this deck, I think, is a clear answer to what do you start to see when a format turns into this kind of grindy mid-range power-based format that we're seeing.
Yeah.
And one of the things you start seeing is stuff like Bol and Zhang's 4-color control list. Okay, now I have to say, whenever a deck like this is viable in the format, I'm pretty happy. So and another thing that I've been seeing pop up as well is the Jeskai Walker's deck.
Okay, yeah.
This is another one of the things that you can do to leverage a format which is like a bit slower and which is trying to get more titans on the board, stuff like that, is you can start to play these decks which just run a bunch of super powerful cards like, Nicol Bolas, Dragon God, running Liliana, stuff like this, right? Because what you're saying with a deck like this is, okay, that's great. Yeah, you can get a bunch of creatures on the board, you can get a bunch of power on the board, but not that many people can keep up with a couple of resolved planeswalkers. This is the kind of deck which says, my plan to go over the top is just to stick a Bolas and a Liliana, or to choke you out with Teferi and Narset in the early game, and then to just siphon your resources away more efficiently than you can to me. Now, I want to just read off the deck list here, because this deck is super, super spicy. It's a little greedy in my opinion, but I mean...
Oh, it's absurd.
But I mean, that's what happens, right? When a format slows down a little bit.
I want to describe this deck. I want to state something about this deck before you read the list. All right, here's your precursor. If I am in control of standard, okay? If they say we'll ban anything you want, you will do whatever you want to standard. If I look at a top 8, like a top 8 of reasonable, of some, not an FNM or whatever, but like something legitimate like this or whatever. If I see this deck, I don't want to see anything else. No bans. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Like, if a deck like this can exist, it can't be bad enough that I want to intervene.
These are some of my favorite decks to play. I actually, in the War of the Spark, and even a little bit into the Eldraine Standard, I was playing a lot of 4-color Super Friends decks, and it's among my favorite kind of Magic to play. So let's get into this. So this deck, the deck list here is 2 Liliana Dreadhorde General, 4 Narset Potter of Veils, 4 Nicol Bolas Dragon God, 4 Teferi Time Raveler. So that already is an aggravating complement of powerful cards to have to play against. The only creatures that's running are 4 Atris Oracle of Half-Truths. And then it follows this up with sorceries. We have 2 Agonizing Remorse, 2 Cry of the Carnarium, 1 Duress, 1 Elder Spell, 4 Thought Erasure. And then it's also running 3 Elspeth Conquers Death and 3 Oath of Kaya. And then, of course, a whole bunch of lands, the most interesting of which is 4 Interplanar Beacons to support that Planeswalker plan. This is clearly a deck which is, just trying to be like the most powerful deck in the room. One of the things that tickles me about this deck is it's going back to the combination of, and it's kind of like the I win button of being able to play Nicol Bolas into the Elder Spell and just win on the spot. For anyone who hasn't seen this interaction, basically what you do is you are aiming to get down at least one of your cheaper planeswalkers and hopefully have it stick around. And also, if you have a card like the Elder Spell, you're hoping that maybe your opponent has at least resolved one planeswalker as well. And so what you can do is, hopefully in one turn, but maybe you just have enough control of the game to be able to do this over several turns, but you just get down your Nicol Bolas, you use your Elder Spell, and you actually will kill off your own planeswalkers as well, because it puts additional loyalty onto your Nicol Bolas so that you can immediately minus it and just win the game on the spot. So that's just one of the combo-y things. That's like the combo kill in this particular deck, and it's made better by a card like Elspeth Conquers Death, because in that scenario, you don't even have to resolve your your Nicol Bolas in the same turn. Like, you don't have to cast your Nicol Bolas and then cast your Elder Spell. You can actually just get it into the graveyard. Either it gets killed, or maybe you even throw it into your graveyard using Thought Erasure. And then you can just play an Elspeth Conquers Death, and then on the turn that you return Nicol Bolas from the graveyard, you can just, boom, cast your Elder Spell. And so, of course, that's not necessarily plan A of the deck, but I just wanted to point out that that was a fun thing that this deck can do.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And if the first thing I would do, so when I play an arena, I'm mostly a ladder guy. I just like to play as many like different Magic games in a row. Like I've never been like sideboarding and like Legacy and stuff is kind of interesting. There's an art to sideboarding, but if it's up to me, I'm much more interested in game ones than 2s and 3s, you know, to my competitive detriment over the years. But so the first thing I would do if I was playing this, and I'm going to, is if I was on the arena ladder, I would go down on Narset, Oath, Cry, Elder Spell. Okay, yeah, somewhere in that, I would take a copy of each of those out and add in 2 Fae of Wishes, so that you make a lot more fun for yourself as you go through the ladder, because it allows you to get the Elder Tutor for quote unquote, get more copies of the Elder Spell without like just having to have one sitting in your deck and it not being great. You know, it's sort of fundamentally a sideboard card traditionally. So in the best of one ladder cards, like in last season it was Mastermind's Acquisition, and now it's Fae of Wishes. On the best of one ladder, if you have a control deck that can operate like out of the sideboard, you have 75 cards when everybody else has 60. It's really fun to exploit that. So if you're going to build this deck for that, I highly recommend at least putting 1 or 2 Fae of Wishes in and sort of messing with that approach.
Yeah, I'm a big fan as well of the Fae of Wishes approach, because you're right, it just makes the effective size of your deck bigger. And this deck is running some really excellent sideboard cards as well. They've got a Command the Dreadhorde in there. They've got D-Spark in there.
Hero.
Yeah, Hero. Heyo.
That I'd have 4.
There you go.
In for a penny, in for a pound.
So you could,
like, they're never going to beat that.
You could pivot into that. Kind of different game plan. But you know, I like the idea of when you have efficient answers in your sideboard, it's nice. So like, for example, the Elder Spell is a really good example of a very efficient, highly impactful card. So when you're playing cards like that, you can just do things like wish for it and then resolve it on the same turn, that's typically one of the issues of Fae of Wishes, is that, you know, oftentimes you don't have enough mana to be able to cast your pivotal spell until next turn, and it gives your opponent a whole turn to set up. So being able to do, you know, to play these impactful cards like D-Spark, and or even if you do have a more expensive card, like a card like Command the Dreadhorde in the sideboard, for example, is the kind of card where it's like, okay, if you can't counter this, or if you can't kill me next turn, this game is going to be mine, you know? So it's also got those kind of I win buttons. Like there are some
I win buttons. Yeah.
There are some games in which you just can't beat a resolved Command the Dreadhorde.
One of the things that interests me about this deck, I don't know that it's seeing play. I don't think it's seeing any play in any of the top 8 decks we're looking at here. But it's interesting of note how hard this deck seems to lean on Interplanar Beacon. It seems like a couple of its spells, I'm not sure. The thing that comes to mind for me is that they reprinted Field of Ruin. And I think that's probably too slow of an effect in most of the format, unless more decks slow down like this. But that's just an angle that maybe it's just a sideboard angle, but it's worth considering. If this deck picks up a lot more traction, it's running, this version's running 1 swamp. So blowing up an Interplanar Beacon could probably do some pretty good action. Other than Bolus, it's just not that. I don't know, man. This deck is so sweet. I'm into this deck.
I'm a fan as well. Now, I would probably feel a little afraid playing this on the ladder, especially the best of one ladder, because you're probably just going to get run over by a lot of mono red.
Yeah, the reds are gonna.
Yeah, they're gonna feast on you playing a deck like this.
I would go up. You're gonna need to go up on Cry, I would guess.
Yeah. So, you know, here's the issue, right? Okay, call me a skeptic on Cry. I'm one of the people who I just have not been particularly feeling Cry. I think that it's worse in this format than it has been in a lot of previous formats. Now, granted, I think a lot of the reason people are running it right now specifically is because graveyard decks are a thing. So being able to, being able to kill even like an Oro and resolve a Cry of the Carnarium in the same turn to exile it is a kind of a next level-y thing you can do. But like Cry of the Carnarium, I think is specifically designed to wreck the Rakdos deck. It's very, very good against that deck. And a good thing to
I'm with
note,
you. I've found it to be situational. Like I've never historically. It's essentially you have to get the additional value out of it. Like Infest is just not a card anymore. So you're going to have to play Cry in, like if you're playing on the BO1 ladder, Cry, as much red and things like that as there are, like, I don't know, man. It's a concession, but I'm with you. Like when the experience is just like, sometimes when you draw it, it's the wrong matchup, especially in like best of one, it feels like just such dead cardboard.
well, and here's my issue with it, is it's not even that good against mono red. Mono red's the kind of deck that can easily get their runaway Steamkin out of range of Cry of the Carnarium. They're leaning on multiple copies. A lot of these decks are running 4 copies of Anax. They're running 4 copies of Torbran. All of the most problematic cards don't get hit by Cry of the Carnarium. And even, a lot of the red decks are also playing the Bone Crusher Giant, which also doesn't get hit. So you're just going to find yourself in a lot of situations where, okay, maybe Cry of the Carnarium will slow them down a little bit. But
yeah, it's never ideal.
Yeah, it's not solving
like we're just
the
not
problem.
In a format. Yeah,
it's not the I win card in the same way that it was against the mono white go wide decks of yesteryear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So a deck like this, I think, gets punished pretty hard by any low to the ground aggro strategy, because as we have learned, I think if there's anything this format has told us, it's that you can't necessarily resolve a Ritual of Soot and have that solve your problems. That's the only thing I would be careful of running this deck. I think the person who brought this knew that they were going to be playing in a tournament meta. Who knows? Maybe a deck like this is viable on the ladder, but I would definitely just keep an eye out, and you might need to make some tweaks, definitely to your main deck, to just account for aggro.
I'm still like 15 feet deep on all my Fae of Wishes possibilities.
You went into your sideboard and you never returned.
Well, you can put Ashiok in the board.
Yeah. I'm a fan of Ashiok, by the way. Ashiok 3, I think, is what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, she's got to have, in a lot of these matchups, like, I mean, Narset's something, but 4 copies of Narset is, like, not amazing against a few of these, like, really low-to-the-ground decks. So that's a spot where you could maybe be interested in sort of trying to steal some metagame share by getting cute. But, hey, if nothing else, you can always Fae of Wishes for it.
I like Ashiok in this current meta, and I haven't been seeing it so much lately. I remember I was seeing a lot of Ashiok a couple of weeks ago. I definitely, and maybe it's just, maybe other cards do it better, or maybe just taking a different tack is more effective, but I would definitely be running Ashiok in the sideboard of a deck like this, no question.
I'm with you there, yeah. I would, you gotta have access to, you know what I mean? Like, it's the critical mass of graveyard relevant cards is just so up there.
It is. I mean, even doing something as simple as just, like we said, turning off your opponent's Elspeth Conquers Deaths, like that.
You really have it out for that card. You know what? I bet that's a story push card.
Probably so.
This thing it's just Emrakul with a mask on.
Yeah.
This is the same. We're dealing with it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I do have it out for that card, but I just think, like, being able to turn off that third mode of Elspeth Conquers Death is such a big game, right? Because what it does is it turns Elspeth Conquers Death into like a 5-mana D-Spark, basically. And that's not a good card, right? So if you can do that while also just disrupt, like, I think a lot of these decks have gotten really used to this play pattern of, it's okay if my Dream Trawler goes to the yard because I'm just going to get it back. Or it's okay if I throw away my Teferi on turn 3 because I'm just going to get it back, right? And if you can slam a card that's like, actually, you're not ever going to get anything back from your graveyard this game, like that really could be enough to just turn the match in your favor.
It could be. It's all about opportunity cost. And like on the BO1, hey, if you don't have the Fae of Wishes Gusto, I can't blame you. But if you're playing in traditional Magic, yeah, I think Ashiok has more than enough to justify some slots on the bench.
Love it. Okay, so let's just cruise down here a little bit and see if we can find anything else that's kind of it. Okay, so here's something that's standing out to me. Now, admittedly, this is one of the villain color combinations here, Mark Jacobson's Sultai Escape deck. But one of the things that interests me about this deck and this kind of archetype is that I think that this deck it's planting its flag pretty strongly as playing like just like the biggest mid-range deck. This is a card that doesn't have like some flashy, nasty finish. This isn't aiming to resolve like an X equals 10 spell. I mean, it does have the Krasis, but it's not aiming to win by just going off on a single turn, right? So this deck is basically, it runs 3 Nissas, it's got 4 Cavalier of Thorns, 4 Hydroid Krasis, 2 Pelucranos, right? So any deck that's running 2 main deck Pelucranos, that should tell you something about the deck's game plan. It's also running 4 Oro, 3 Casualties of War, which is another like, okay, this is a Casualties of War deck, right? So what is your overall take on this? Because when I first look at this deck, I was kind of skeptical. And one of the reasons I was skeptical is that this deck really doesn't have any of that, like, I win button going on. And I feel like, I don't know, I wonder if being just like the most mid-range of mid-rangey decks is enough in this format. What do you think about that?
This list is so fascinating. Like, it's the Aethergust. Aethergust may be like the most fascinating case study in this format because it's such a nothing card. But it just necessarily should. Even in formats with full-blown traditional access to sideboards, it's seeing so much main deck play in these little pockets of, like, this format is just so silly.
It is. Like, it is. And
Aethergust.
And just to clarify, this deck has an eyebrow-raising 3 Aethergusts in the main, right? So this isn't just like...
It's amazing.
This isn't just filling in that flex spot that you couldn't, you know, like come up with another card for. No, this is like a dedicated slot just to Aethergust.
It's got the 4th on the board too.
Yeah.
Can't be too careful. I don't think I would play 3 Aethergust main if Painter's Servant was legal. Yeah, like, man, that's awesome though. Like, I'm into it. I'm not smart enough to understand it. So the thing that jumps out the most to me, and this came up a little bit in the other one, is it's really interesting the thought erasure sharing space with Agonizing Remorse. Like, that's an interesting sort of slot tension that I think is interesting. So that's like, you have one that essentially enables, or like, I mean, like, at least to some extent, like, it helps enable escape and graveyard business, and the other one is sort of against it. It's just like, that's going to be, I love Magic problems that probably won't ever have a solution. Like, I don't think we'll ever know, like, exactly which deck should, you know what I mean? Like, that's not a solvable problem. So that's a slot that instantly jumps out at me. Pelucranos is such this. I think you can do this. I don't see a reason you say that doesn't have a I win button. I frequently feel like Nissa Shakes the World is an I win button.
I mean, she definitely bumps up the percentage. I think you're right that as far as single card power level goes, Nissa is head and shoulders above any other card in this deck.
I think the way to look at this deck, okay, is if you have the last deck we looked at and the Bant mid-range deck, like the traditional ones, if these decks are occupying the space that is at the control decks way, way, way above, trying to go over these other decks, this to me reads like, if I had to guess, like, the mentality behind building this for this tournament, I would say that the goal was probably to be not necessarily like the most dig your heel, whatever, but the fastest of that kind of deck for the card value, essentially. It's trying to be a mid-range deck, but not the one that necessarily can dig its heels in all the way or whatever. But it wants to be the mid-range deck that is presenting the question first, so that the other mid-range deck is forced to play on its terms. And since, I mean, what's the difference? If you're playing Uro against other Uro decks, you may as well have the deck that can go faster, if not bigger. So I think that's probably it. And when you add Casualties of War and Thought Erasure, you get access to like a lot more disruption and a lot. That's going to be like a level of just sort of sniping things that just some of these other decks are just not going to have access to. So the Aether Gust is still fascinating me, but I think on principle, like I mean, like I don't know if I'd come to the same conclusion if I had like the exact same strategy Mark was going in with. But I think like the strategy is a really, really good idea. And obviously like it worked, but I'm still just so hung up on the Aether Gust. Like I'm trying to just digest all the things that says about the format.
Well, and I keep coming back to this Rakdos deck, but it's actually one of the reasons I like running that Rakdos deck in this format is if you come up against this deck running all these Aether Gusts, I mean, you can easily just play a game of like, great, I just resolved 6 black creatures in a row. You know, have fun with that Aether Gust. So I think that that's something that you need to be careful of in this format, because as good as Aether Gust is, like, for example, if I did run up against the Rakdos deck, I might consider not siding in my 4th Aether Gust, and I might actually consider siding one of them out. As weird as that sounds, right? Because that...
No, that's... Yeah, you should never be overly, like, slavish to, like, intuitive color words and things like that. Because, like, the dynamics of how matchup plays out is way more nuanced and subtle and all that stuff than just, like, you put the protection from black creature in against the pro black or against the mono black deck or whatever. Now, sometimes that matters and sometimes that's enough, but your approach is much more rewarding, I think. On by and large, like the subtle sideboarding is a much better way to do that. You shouldn't just automatically see Mayhem Devil and go, oh, all these Aether Gusts need to stay in. This is a Rakdos deck or whatever. You need to think sort of beyond that.
Yeah, to me, this looks like the kind of deck which is aiming to do something like play Pelucranos into Nissa, into Casualties of War, maybe like Erasure into Pelucranos, into Nissa, into Casualties of War, and just kind of hope that you can throw enough, you know, right hooks at your opponent that they're not going to recover from one of them.
Casualties of War is a card I have similar experience with, and it's sort of, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me sort of like Violent Ultimatum. It reminds me of a card that it has enough oomph that if you can reliably get to it, it doesn't matter that it's not necessarily the most efficient thing. It's more about if you can just sort of break their legs early enough or efficiently enough, which is probably more the case here. I would guess it's more of a cleanup act in this deck. It seems like you jam the ramp and get where you can, and then you've got a Flying Krasis, and then you can blow up whatever you need and then just kill them or whatever. But at the same time, like, it's just such an efficient card that it really reminds me of something like a Violent Ultimatum, where you look at it and sort of go, this is an EDH plant, this is this. But in the right states, like, if you build the right support around it, there's no reason why a card like that in a format where people are playing these giant planeswalkers and things, and that's a viable thing. I wouldn't want it against would you want it against the Rakdos deck? So, I mean, maybe this deck isn't, like you were saying, for more reasons. I don't know that I'd want to be against Rakdos with this deck, but I don't know. If the format comes back around again, it's a really cool angle to approach, but like, I don't know that I'd want this as just like my default everyday deck.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think that it's okay. So this deck, I think, is another one of these decks that subtly reminds me of old Magic. Even though it's running a lot of hot new cards, this is one of the decks that reminds me the most of the way that people previously tried to win. You know, there's a lot of beef in this deck. Like, I think people are, you know, you're aiming to resolve a lot of of 4, 6, 8 mana spells that are just going to be like these heavy hitters. You're just trying to destroy Tokyo with every card that you resolve. And that's fine sometimes, and it's never going to be like a terrible approach to Magic. But to me, this kind of makes me think, it's almost being that person who plays Jund in Modern, right? Being that mid-range player in a broken format where you're trying to do a bunch of semi-fair things against people who are trying to do a bunch of unfair things. And sometimes you get there. This is a deck that's more likely to get there with a bad draw than a broken deck is to get there with a bad draw, because the average power level of each individual card is high. But I think any deck that's trying to present kind of a really overwhelming turn, or a deck that's trying to race towards some really busted finish as quickly as it can, it might just catch you with your pants down. And I also think that this is a deck that can fall prey to... I think that this deck probably hates Elspeth Conquers Death. So, I don't know. I'm curious. This is a list that I want to try because it might exceed my expectations, but this was one of the more eyebrow-raising lists in this particular roundup for me.
Yeah, it's a wild one. It's cool. I think I give it more modern in the contemporary sense, not modern as in the format. So I give it a little more credit in terms of like versus old school sort of Timmy big dumb creature Magic, because the 14 creatures in this deck all have orange symbols, and they're all designed in that sort of like contemporary mythic nutso way. It's essentially a nutso spell with some numbers on it. You know what I mean? It's not a creature in sort of the Ernim Jin sense. These are like cards that do something regardless. So I think if you just shove a critical mass of these things and can reliably cast them, and I think more the issue is that I don't know. We talk so much about the Rakdos deck that it's just like, I don't know that I'd want to play this deck where everybody knows that that's a deck.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't want to do it with Casualties of War. So
yeah, or even mono red. Like, this seems like a deck that might just be surprisingly weak to mono red.
And we haven't seen like, there was like, I don't see any red in this 8.
Right.
So like if there's going to be a deck that, or a time where this sneaks in, it would be like the red deck is staying at home or whatever. But.
Yeah. And again, this is sight unseen. I haven't played this list, so maybe it's more resilient to that stuff than we're thinking, but that's just kind of what comes to my mind when I'm...
Look at that land count, too.
I know, man. Hey,
oh, baby.
Some people are running 30.
Yeah.
I mean...
That'll shake the world.
This one's at
Those
29,
are your win cons, right?
Yeah, this is... I think if this doesn't tell you something about what's good in Standard right now, then again, you're not paying attention, right? It's all about mana, dude. Standard is all about mana right now. Anyway, we're coming up on an hour and a half in this conversation, and I feel like you and I could easily spend that same amount of time again just digging more into what's happening in the Standard, but I hope for you listening that this discussion has at least illuminated a little bit of what we're thinking about in Standard, and maybe this has helped for you to get a step more towards digging into this format and finding something that might be interesting for you. I would say, unabashedly, if you're feeling bored in Standard right now, I would start messing around with this 4-color control deck from Bol and Zhang, or maybe it's Zhang. Don't know how to pronounce that, but anyway, I would start messing around with this. I would also start looking at some other Super Friends, Planeswalker heavy options, because I just think that there's a space for that right now in the format, and I think it can actually end up being the most powerful mid-rangey plan. And again, if you're wanting to be super competitive, and if you're wanting to play low curve and just kind of grind your way up the ladder, I would probably recommend that one of these Rakdos Sacrifice decks. Like we said, we kept coming back to it. It's just a very, very strong archetype, and it's a difficult one to attack. It's a difficult one to play around. I think it's a deck that requires some pretty dedicated hate to really make it look bad. And So I think all of those are in its favor. That's kind of my recommendation based on what we've discussed here. Do you have any additional thoughts for like a player who's feeling bored with the format and what they might sleeve up to take out onto the ladder?
I do want to note, if you're picking up this Rakdos deck, especially because you won't be the only one picking it up, a lot of your edges you're going to get in these aristocrats style matchups is off of sacrificial math, and especially with Cauldron Familiars, making your life totals do sort of the Pong thing, like you sort of hit it back and forth, take one, gain one, take one, get that kind of thing. It's really going to reward players who A, practice, and B, really, really work on the nuances of being able to outsmart someone by finding a way to sort of fireball them that they're not expecting. Like, if this deck catches on, those players are the ones who are going to win tournaments.
That's a really good point. And I think the card Mayhem Devil in general, that's one of those cards which will make you reevaluate how good you are at Magic. Because I guarantee any game that Mayhem Devil sits on the battlefield for a while, you will probably miss damage with it, or you will probably misevaluate how much damage you could produce with it. And yeah, I really love that you brought this up. It's one of these things that just surprisingly punishes so many little things. Like, for example, if your opponent cracks their Fabled Passage, they're taking a damage off of your Mayhem Devil, right? Or when your Croxer comes down, it's doing a point of damage off of Mayhem Devil. There's a surprising amount of things that get sacrificed in this format that you don't realize. Even your opponent's Oro gets sacrificed if you didn't escape it, right? And so now they're only gaining 2 life.
One of the for the paper kids, if you're inexperienced or you haven't sort of taken a plunge into Arena, or actually even Moto specifically for this purpose, you'd be amazed at how much you can learn about the flow and optimizing your play by having a program that takes care of those triggers for you by and large. It really teaches, like, it's sort of the training wheels for triggers. And then by the time you go back to your paper game, you're going to forget a lot less of them. It's going to be more instinctual. So that's the thing a lot of players overlook as well. Yep. It's a good resource.
Yep. However, I think anyone playing this deck in paper is probably still missing triggers and missing damage if they're not hyper vigilant. So yeah, just
move your hands quickly.
Indeed.
Yeah, go quick, because
indeed
sometimes you're going to need a lot of goofy triggers and stuff to win.
Yeah. Play quickly in those early turns, right? Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Danny. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I've really appreciated having your perspective. And where can people find you on the internet?
Very few places. I'm a bit eccentric in that regard. I'm somewhat of a social media opt-out, but at the same time, I do spend time Indestructible D West on Twitch. I do some things on there sometimes, not always Magic related, but relating to Magic, you can find my work at coolstuffinc.com. I've actually, speaking of that, I've got an article series, I believe, coming up that's going to celebrate the best of Magic card design. I'm doing an article series on 75 cards through history that I think really exemplify cards that were not problematic, and sort of celebrating why they weren't and why they work so well. So check that out on Cool Stuff Incorporated.
That's awesome. I like your kind of swinging the pendulum the other way, you know?
Yeah, you know. I got solutions. Got to find them.
All right. Well, thank you, Danny. Good luck out there on the ladder. Hopefully we will talk at some point again in the future. And thank you once again for listening. You can find ArenaCraft on Twitter and on YouTube at ArenaCraftPod. Also on Twitch with the same name. You can email us at arenacraftpod@gmail.com. And if you follow us on any of the platforms or join the Discord, you will be entered into a monthly $20 drawing. I know there's a lot of excitement brewing right now for Ikoria. A bunch of Ikoria spoilers are dropping, and I'm excited to get into that as well. So next week's episode will be focused exclusively on Ikoria spoilers. I'm looking forward to it, so I will see you then.